For 21 nights, the most feared man in Asia lay dying in a locked hospital room, and the only person who talked to him was a cleaning woman who didn't even know his name. She had no idea she was whispering bedtime stories to a king. He had no idea she was the only reason he was still breathing, but someone else knew exactly who she was, and they were already coming for her. If you're watching this, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel all the way to the end. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. The night they brought Kang Min Jae into Seoul Central Hospital, it was raining so hard the ambulance driver couldn't see the curb. 3 paramedics worked on him in the back of the vehicle while it was still moving, their hands slick with blood that wouldn't stop coming. One of them, a young woman barely 2 years out of nursing school, later told her supervisor she had never seen a man take that much damage and still have a pulse. 4 bullets, 2 of them deep, 1 grazing the left lung, 1 lodged 2 centimeters from his spine. The surgeon who met them at the emergency bay looked at the scan results, looked at the man on the gurney, and told the attending nurses to prepare the family for the worst. There was no family. There were 12 men in black suits standing in the corridor outside the operating room, none of them speaking, all of them watching the door with the flat, patient stillness of people who had learned long ago how to wait for bad news. One of them, taller than the others, with a jaw like poured concrete and a small gold pin on his lapel shaped like a hawk, stood slightly apart from the rest. His name was Park Jun-seok, and he was Min Jae's second in command, and if you had looked closely at his face while those surgeons fought for his boss's life, you might have noticed something that didn't belong there. Not grief, not fear. Calculation. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the operating room door the same way a man watches a clock when he needs to catch a flight. Measured, controlled, privately satisfied with the schedule. Min Jae survived the surgery. Barely. The bullet near his spine had done something the neurosurgeon described in careful, hedged language. Something about pressure and swelling and pathways that weren't responding the way they should. He was alive in the technical sense. His heart moved, his lungs inflated, but his eyes stayed closed, and nothing behind them seemed to be home anymore. And when the doctor came out to speak to the men in the corridor, he used the phrase persistent vegetative state, in a tone that was clearly meant to be the end of a conversation rather than the beginning of one. Jun-seok nodded slowly when he heard it. He thanked the doctor. He turned to the others and spoke in a low voice, and whatever he said caused 3 of the 12 men to pull out their phones almost simultaneously. The others dispersed down the hallway in different directions, unhurried, professional. Jun-seok himself lingered a moment longer, looking at the closed door behind which Kang Min Jae lay, connected to machines that breathed for him. Then he straightened his lapel pin, turned, and walked away. Naomi Carter arrived for her shift at 11:15 that night, which was technically 15 minutes late, which was technically the 3rd time this week, which she knew because her supervisor, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. O, who smelled perpetually of instant coffee and grievance, was waiting at the service entrance with a clipboard and an expression that had already decided the conversation was going to go badly. "You're late again," Mrs. O said. "I know." Naomi pulled her ID badge from her coat pocket and clipped it to her uniform. "My sitter was late. It won't happen again." "You said that Tuesday." "I know. If it happens a 4th time, I know, Mrs. O." She said it quietly, without heat, because she had learned a long time ago that arguing with this woman burned energy she couldn't afford to waste. She needed this job. She needed it the way she needed air and water and the particular brand of children's fever medication that was the only one Amara would take without screaming. She needed it with a specificity and desperation that she kept very carefully off her face at all times, because people who could smell desperation on you had a way of using it. Mrs. O held the look a moment longer, long enough to establish that she was the one choosing to let it go, not the other way around, and then handed Naomi her assignment sheet for the night. 3rd floor, East Wing. 6 rooms, 2 common areas, 1 supply closet that was perpetually damp and never fully cleaned, no matter how many times she scrubbed it. And room 317. She noticed it on the sheet and almost didn't think twice about it. It had been added 3 days ago, circled in red ink with a handwritten note underneath. Special assignment. Minimum disturbance protocol. Do not interact with patient or medical personnel beyond what is strictly required. Do not discuss room contents with other staff. She had heard things, of course. The whole hospital had heard things, or at least felt them. The new weight in the air, the security guards who weren't regular security guards, the way the third-floor nurses lowered their voices when they passed a certain door. But Naomi had a rule about other people's business, which was that it wasn't hers, and she had enough of her own. She took the assignment sheet and went to get her cart. The third floor at 11:30 at night was the kind of quiet that had texture to it. Not peaceful quiet. Institutional quiet. The low hum of fluorescent lights and medical equipment, the occasional soft percussion of a nurse's shoes on linoleum, the distant complaint of a patient who didn't want to be turned. Naomi moved through it the way she always did, efficiently and without drawing attention, the wheels of her cart making a sound that she had long since stopped hearing. She worked the common areas first, mopped the waiting alcove near the elevator, wiped down the windowsills, restocked the hand sanitizer dispensers that the day shift always let run out. She worked steadily and didn't stop moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking right now had a way of running straight into the brick wall of her finances. The eviction notice was in her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it there for 4 days because she couldn't figure out what to do with it. Putting it on the kitchen table meant Amara might find it and ask questions. Leaving it at home meant forgetting it was real. Keeping it in her pocket meant it was always there. A small rectangular piece of paper that weighed approximately nothing and felt like it weighed everything. $4,700. That was the number. Back rent plus late fees plus the administration charge the building manager had added with the kind of cheerful indifference that only people who have never been poor can manage. $4,700 by the end of the month, or she and her daughter were out. She had $2,200 in her savings account. She had 3 weeks left in the month. She had one job that paid slightly above minimum wage and a sick child whose daycare costs ate nearly a third of it. She had done the math so many times the numbers had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like walls closing in. She mopped the floor. She moved to the next room. Room 317 was at the end of the east corridor, past the nurse's station and around a corner that felt slightly removed from the rest of the floor, like it had been designed that way deliberately. There were 2 men seated in chairs outside the door. Not hospital staff, not in any uniform Naomi recognized. Suits. The kind of suits that were cut to move in but didn't need to advertise it. One of them watched her approach with the particular blankness of someone who has been trained to assess threats and has already decided she's not one but hasn't entirely ruled it out. She stopped her cart. "I'm here for the room." The man looked at her badge, looked at the cart, looked at something on his phone. ID. She handed it over. He held it for a moment, read something, handed it back, nodded toward the door. Inside it was darker than the rest of the floor. The overhead lights turned off, only the pale glow of the medical monitors casting anything into visibility. The equipment was more extensive than any room she'd cleaned on this floor. More screens. More lines running from the bed to machines she didn't know the names of. A chart on a rolling stand covered in notation she couldn't have read even if she'd tried. And in the bed, motionless, was a man. She had seen patients before. She had worked in hospitals for 6 years and seen people in all states and conditions, and she had developed the clinical detachment that the work required, the ability to look at a human body in distress and see a task to be completed, a room to be cleaned, an environment to be maintained. She was good at it. It was a kind of armor, but there was something about this man that made the armor slip just for a second. He was big, broad through the shoulders in a way that was still visible beneath the hospital gown and the blankets, a physical density that the equipment and the stillness couldn't quite erase. His face was, she didn't let herself look too long, angular, severe, the kind of features that would have read as powerful if the muscles underneath them weren't completely slack. His head had been partially shaved where a bandage was secured above his left ear. His arms lay at his sides on top of the blanket, and she noticed without meaning to that they were covered from wrist to shoulder in tattoos, dark and dense and intricate, dragons and symbols she didn't recognize winding up both forearms. She looked away and began her work. She was quiet about it. Minimum disturbance protocol, the sheet had said, and she was good at quiet. She worked around the edges of the room, the floor near the door, the windowsill, the small attached bathroom that she cleaned without turning on the main light. She was methodical and thorough and didn't make unnecessary sounds, and the whole time the machines beeped their soft, steady rhythms, and the man in the bed didn't move at all. She was almost done when she realized she had been in the room for 20 minutes and hadn't said a word, which was unusual for her. She talked to patients sometimes, the long-term ones, the ones who had been there long enough that she'd become a familiar presence in their rooms. Not conversation, exactly, just words. Something human in the silence. She looked at him again. The monitors, the stillness, the fact that according to everything she'd been told in her 6 years of this work, nobody was home behind those closed eyes. Long night, she said quietly. Not to him, really, to the room, to something she couldn't name. She finished her work. She left. She came back the next night. It happened gradually, the way most things that change your life happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in small increments. Each one so minor you don't notice until you're already somewhere different from where you started. The second night, she was wiping down the windowsill when she said, almost to herself, I don't know why they keep the blinds closed in here. You can see the Han River from this floor if the angle's right. She paused. Not that it matters to you right now, but it's there. The third night, she told him that her daughter had eaten an entire bowl of rice without complaining, which was remarkable, and that the rice had been slightly overcooked because Naomi had been distracted trying to pay a bill online while cooking it, and that her daughter hadn't cared about the overcooked rice, but had cared very much about the fact that there was no banana for dessert, and had expressed this concern with the full force of 2.5-year-old lungs. Her name is Amara, Naomi said, wringing out her mop. It means grace in some languages. I looked it up when I was pregnant. I needed something to mean something. The monitors beeped. The machines breathed. He didn't move. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this. She straightened up, looking at him for a moment. I don't know. You seem like someone who hasn't had a lot of people talk to him just to talk to him, without wanting something back. She tilted her head slightly. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. She finished the room and left. She came back the fourth night, and the fifth. By the second week, it had become a thing, not a significant thing. She was clear with herself about that. She had too much real life pressing in on her from all sides to attach significance to a habit. But she talked to him while she cleaned, and it had started to feel not necessary exactly. More like a small portion of the night that was hers, uncomplicated, free from the weight of everything she owed and everything she feared. She talked to him about Amar's fever that had broken Tuesday morning and come back Wednesday night, about the leak under the kitchen sink that the building manager still hadn't sent anyone to fix, about the bus ride to work and the way the city looked at night from the upper deck, all lit up and enormous and indifferent. She talked to him the way you talk to someone you trust not to respond, which, she understood, was a strange thing to trust about a person. But there it was. She didn't know his name. She hadn't asked. She'd noticed the name on the chart on her first night but hadn't read it. It wasn't her chart to read. She thought of him, internally, as the man in 317, which was not a poetic designation, but was an honest one. She had no idea who he was. If she had known, if she had understood what that name on the chart connected to, what that face connected to, what those tattoos on his arms meant to the people who recognized them, she would have cleaned the room in 3 minutes flat and never spoken another word inside it. She would have walked faster past that door every night and kept her head down and been grateful for the things she didn't know. But she didn't know. And so she talked. Minjae was not dead. This was the thing nobody outside of a very specific set of medical professionals understood because the word coma, in the public understanding of it, meant absence, meant void, meant the lights off and no one inside. And there were elements of that. There were long stretches where there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, no thread of consciousness he could follow back to himself. Just blank, undifferentiated dark. But there were other stretches, other moments. They came without warning and left the same way, but they came. And in them, he was aware of things. Not visually, not with any of the ordinary senses operating normally. More like impressions. Fragments of sound that didn't quite resolve into meaning but carried tone, carried texture, carried something he kept reaching for and couldn't hold. The first time he was aware of her, he didn't know what he was aware of. A voice. Female. Not distressed, not clinical, not performing any particular function he could identify. Just present. Speaking in the particular register of someone who didn't expect an answer. He couldn't follow the words. Not at first. They reached him like sound through water, shaped but not intelligible, carrying feeling without content. But they were consistent. They came back. Night after night, at roughly the same time, the same voice in the same room, and gradually, over days, over something that registered in him as the passage of time even without clocks. He began to surface far enough to catch pieces of it. Amara. He heard that word more than others. He didn't know what it meant at first. Just a word. Just a sound. But it came with something. A change in the voice when it said that word. A particular quality of warmth that made the darkness around him feel slightly less absolute. He held on to it. He didn't know why. He held on to it the way a drowning man holds on to the thing he can reach. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't open his eyes or lift his hand or do anything that would indicate to the people monitoring his body that anything was happening inside it. But something was happening. Something had started to happen the moment that voice entered the room on whatever night it first came, and it had not stopped happening since. He heard her say one night, "Amar asked me today if I had a friend. I told her I had friends. She said, a real one. Kids know things. Don't ask me how." A pause. The familiar sounds of the mop moving across the floor. I didn't have a good answer for her. Another night, quieter, more tired sounding than usual. "We got another notice from the landlord. I'm trying not to panic. Panic doesn't help. I know that. I've known that for a long time. Knowing it and not panicking are apparently two different skills." Another night, almost amused despite something underneath that wasn't, Amara put a bandage on her stuffed elephant today because the elephant wasn't feeling well. She's 2.5. Where do they learn that? Where does that come from? And Min Jae, somewhere in the dark that wasn't quite dark anymore, held on to these fragments, categorized them, built them into something that functioned in the absence of everything else, like a picture of the world outside the dark. A world that contained a small girl named Amara and a woman who loved her with the specific, exhausted, relentless love of someone who had no backup. He didn't know why this mattered to him. He was not, in any life he could remember, a man for whom other people's small domestic realities mattered. He had built his empire on the understanding that sentiment was a weapon other people left lying around for you to use against them, and he had never once been tempted to pick it up for himself. But he was somewhere that was not his life, and the voice was the only thing in it that reached him. So he held on. The crisis, when it came, didn't announce itself. It was a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after Min Jae had been admitted, and Naomi was 40 minutes into her shift when she got the call. She was in the supply closet pulling fresh linens when her phone buzzed against her hip, and she looked at the screen and felt something drop in her chest. It was Mrs. Yoon, the sitter. Amara had a fever. A real one. Not the low-grade warmth that came and went, and could be managed with medication and fluids. The thermometer had said 39.8 and climbing, and Amara was crying in a way she hadn't cried since she was an infant, and Mrs. Yoon's voice on the phone had the quality of someone reporting the beginning of an emergency. Naomi stood in the supply closet with the linens in her hands and did the math. There were no options she liked. Leaving work mid-shift would trigger the conversation with Mrs. O that she could not afford to have. Taking Amara to the emergency room would cost money she did not have and take time she could not predict. Calling anyone else? There was no one else. Amara's father was gone in the thorough, permanent way that some men managed to be gone without technically dying. Naomi's mother was in Atlanta and 73 years old, and that was not a call she was going to make at midnight. She called Mrs. Yoon back. She told her to keep Amara cool and hydrated and that she would figure something out and she would be there as soon as she could. Then she stood in the supply closet for 30 seconds and breathed, which was all the time she gave herself for the breathing part, and then she started moving. She finished the 3 rooms she had left on her list as fast as she could without it being visible that she was rushing. She was efficient and thorough because she was always efficient and thorough, because being otherwise was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Then she clocked out, went down to the service entrance and called a car. The driver was 20 minutes away. She stood in the rain outside the service entrance and tried to reach Mrs. Yoon again and couldn't get through. Tried again. Nothing. The car didn't show up. She waited. The rain increased. She called the car service and was told there had been a system issue and the driver had been reassigned and a new car was coming, but the wait time was now 45 minutes, which was, she stood very still for a moment and felt the rain on her face and did not say what she was thinking, because saying it wouldn't help. She went back inside. She knew what she was about to do was a violation of approximately 4 different policies she had been explicitly told about. She knew it could cost her the job she desperately needed. She understood this clearly and completely, And it did not change anything because there are things that come before jobs. There are things that come before everything, and the sound of your child sick and crying is one of them. She called Mrs. Yoon from the stairwell and told her to bring Amara to the hospital, not the emergency entrance, the service entrance on Donghoro, where the staff came in. Mrs. Yoon started to protest, and Naomi said very quietly and very clearly, "Please." And something in the word got through because 3 minutes later Mrs. Yoon said she would come. Naomi went back upstairs. She sat in the supply alcove on the 3rd floor and waited. She was completely still, which was how she dealt with things that felt like they were too large to fit inside a body. She got very still and very controlled and kept her face completely neutral, and from the outside she looked like a woman taking a break between tasks. 40 minutes later, she was holding her daughter in the stairwell near the service entrance when the car finally arrived. Amara was burning. 40.1, Mrs. Yoon said, pressing a damp cloth against the child's forehead. The little girl was limp and glassy-eyed and making a low, unhappy sound that wasn't quite crying, more like protesting, weakly, against the discomfort of existing. Naomi pressed her palm against Amara's forehead and felt the heat and she felt something that she would not name, because naming it would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for. "I've got her," she told Mrs. Yoon. "Thank you. Go home." Mrs. Yoon went. Naomi stood in the stairwell with her sick child and looked at the car that was waiting to take them. Where? Home, where there were no clean linens because she hadn't done laundry this week. Home, where the temperature in the apartment had been running low because she'd turned the thermostat down to cut the utility bill. Home, where there was nothing she could do that she couldn't do here. She looked down at Amara. Amara looked back up at her with heavy, fever-bright eyes. "I know," Naomi said softly. "I know, baby. I'm thinking." She made a decision. She was not entirely sure it was the right one. She made it anyway. She sent the car away. Tata. The east corridor of the 3rd floor at 1:15 in the morning was empty. The nurse's station was attended by a single nurse who was currently on the other side of the station reviewing charts, her back to the corridor. The 2 security men outside room 317 were there. They were always there. But the space between the stairwell and the door to the room was partially shielded by a medication cart that had been left against the wall. Naomi moved quickly. She had the badge. She knew the floor. She knew the patterns. She slipped inside room 317 with Amara against her chest and pushed the door closed behind her without a sound. The monitors. The machines. The dark room with its quiet hum of equipment, and the man in the bed who hadn't moved in 3 weeks. Amara made a small sound and shifted against her mother's shoulder, restless and hot and uncomfortable in the way of sick children who can't explain what's wrong, only that it is. Naomi stood against the wall just inside the door, breathing carefully. She had a vague plan. Wait here, in the relative quiet, while Amara's medication, she had given her something in the stairwell, had a chance to work. Avoid the emergency room charges, not go back out into the rain. That was the whole plan. It was not an elegant plan. Amara started to cry. It was the exhausted, low-resource cry of a child who had been sick too long. Not screaming, not theatrical, just a consistent, miserable sound that Naomi had learned she couldn't stop by any means other than comfort. She moved to the chair beside the bed and sat down and rocked her daughter and murmured to her, and tried, with everything she had, to keep the sound contained. It didn't work. Amara escalated. The little girl's body was hot and rigid, and she pressed her face against her mother's neck and cried with the specific desolation of someone who didn't understand why they felt this bad and needed someone to make it stop. Naomi had run out of options. She looked at the man in the bed, at his broad, still chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of the ventilator. She looked at her daughter. She hesitated for only a moment. Then gently, carefully, she leaned over and placed Amara against Min-jae's chest. The child immediately went still, not calm, not asleep, just suddenly, startlingly quiet. The crying stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Amara turned her head slightly, her hot cheek against the fabric of the hospital gown, and made a small sound that was not a cry and not quite contentment, but something hovering in between. Naomi straightened up. Her hands were still half raised, ready to pull her daughter back. Her heart was loud in her ears. Amara's eyes drifted shut. 20 seconds later, the little girl was asleep. Naomi stood perfectly still and watched her daughter breathe, watched the small rib cage rise and fall, watched the tension ease out of Amara's tiny body, and felt something she couldn't immediately identify work its way through her own chest. The monitors beeped, the machines hummed, and then very quietly, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, not the way things changed in the stories she'd grown up with. Just a shift, a variation in one of the rhythms, a note in the electronic chorus of the room that hadn't been there before. Naomi looked at the screens without understanding them, but she had been in this room for 3 weeks, and she had learned the sound of these machines the way you learn the sound of your own apartment at night. And something was different. The pulse monitor showed a number that was... She didn't know what the number should be. But the line that had been flat and slow had developed, subtly, a quality that hadn't been there before. Something more. She looked at him. His hands were still. His face was still. His eyes were closed. But his fingers... The fingers of his right hand, which lay on the blanket at his side 6 inches from her daughter's foot, had tightened, very slightly, around nothing. Naomi's breath stopped. The door opened. One of the night nurses, a woman named Ji Young, who had never bothered to hide the fact that she found Naomi's presence on this floor merely tolerable, stepped into the room with a chart in her hand and stopped when she saw them. Looked at Naomi. Looked at the child on the patient's chest. Looked at the monitors. Her face changed. She took 1 step toward the bed, reaching automatically, professionally, for the child, and Min Jae's arm came off the blanket. It was not fast. It was not the sudden violent motion of the movies. It was slow, deliberate. The arm of a man fighting through enormous weight and distance to do a specific thing. His right hand rose from the blanket, and his fingers closed around Ji Young's wrist before she reached Amara, and the grip, even after 3 weeks of atrophy, was enough to stop her completely. Ji Young made a sound. She looked down at the hand on her wrist. She looked at the face. The face was looking back at her. Kang Min-jae's eyes were open. Not fully, not the wide-awake clarity of a man who hadn't been unconscious for 21 days. Narrow. Heavy. The eyes of a man who had traveled a very long distance and was still finding his bearings. But open. Aware. Present. They moved slowly, effortfully, from Ji Young's face to the child on his chest, to the small, sleeping weight of Amara, her fever-flushed cheek against his sternum, her small hand curled near his collarbone. Then to Naomi. Naomi could not move. She stood beside the bed and looked at those eyes and felt the room around her recede until it was just that, just this man's eyes finding her face, and something in them that she could not have named but that reached her regardless. Recognition. Not of who she was, of what she was. The voice. The one thing in the dark that had not left. Ji Young was trying to say something. Words were coming out of her, but they weren't reaching Naomi yet. Min Jae's grip on her wrist had not loosened. He was still looking at Naomi. His lips moved. No sound came out. He tried again. His throat worked. The machines around him had begun a different conversation than the one they'd been having for 3 weeks. Higher pitched, more urgent, pulling attention and resources toward this room. He got one word out, rough, barely voiced, scraped from somewhere very deep. Stay. The nurse's station alarm went off. Footsteps in the corridor, the door bursting open behind Naomi. People flooding in. A doctor's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the sudden noise. And Min Jae's eyes still on her face. And Amara, impossibly, still asleep on his chest through all of it. And Naomi Carter standing at the bedside of a man she didn't know, who had just returned from somewhere she couldn't follow, holding the one word he'd chosen to spend his first breath on. Stay. The room was full of people now, and all of them were moving, and none of them were looking at her, and nobody had told her to leave yet, and she did not leave. She stood there. She stayed. The room did not slow down for anyone. 3 doctors came through the door in the first 90 seconds, followed by 2 nurses Naomi had never seen before, and then a man in a suit who was not a doctor and was not pretending to be one. He stood against the wall near the door with his hands in front of him and watched everything with the particular stillness of someone who was paid to observe and report, not intervene. The monitors were screaming in their polite electronic way, all of them registering the same impossible fact. The man in the bed was conscious, was responsive, was present in a room that had been built around his absence. Naomi pressed herself back against the far wall and held Amara, who had finally woken up when the door burst open and was now clinging to her mother's neck with both arms and watching the room with enormous, fever-bright eyes that took in the machinery and the people and the urgency without understanding any of it, only that it was loud and there were too many strangers. The doctor running the response, a compact man in his late 40s named Seo, who had the exhausted authority of someone who had been called back from home at an unreasonable hour, was checking Min-jae's pupils with a light while calling out instructions to the nurses in a voice that was controlled but moving fast. He asked Min-jae to track the light. Min-jae tracked it, slowly, with the weighted effort of a man lifting something heavy for the first time in weeks. Seo asked him to squeeze his hand. He squeezed it. Seo asked him his name. A pause. Long enough that Naomi thought maybe it was too much, too fast, too soon. That whatever had come back had only come back partially, that the word he'd spoken earlier had been a last reflex rather than a beginning. Then, in a voice that was almost nothing, dried out, ruined by 3 weeks of disuse, barely shaped by his mouth, Min-jae said his name. Seo straightened up. He looked at the nurse beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Seo said very quietly, "Get Dr. Park on the phone. Now." Nobody had told Naomi to leave. She understood that this was oversight rather than permission, but she stayed anyway, her back against the wall, Amara's face pressed against her shoulder. She watched them work. She watched Min-jae's eyes, which kept moving, slowly, heavily, around the room, taking inventory of where he was and who was in it. They landed on the suited man near the door. Something passed across Min-jae's face when he saw him. Not fear. Closer to recognition with something hard underneath it. The suited man took out his phone and left the room without a word. By 2:30 in the morning, the third floor had transformed. 4 more men in suits had arrived, these ones with the crisp, controlled energy of people who had been waiting for exactly this call and had been ready to move the moment it came. They conferred in the corridor outside 317 in low voices, their postures suggesting urgency being carefully managed. Ji Young, the night nurse who had been grabbed, was at the station filling out an incident report with hands that weren't quite steady. The 2 original security men outside the door had been replaced by 3 new ones, broader, younger, positioned slightly differently, the way furniture gets rearranged in a room when someone understands the room better. Naomi was in the small family consultation alcove at the end of the corridor with Amara asleep in her lap and a paper cup of vending machine tea that she hadn't touched. She had been told, by a nurse she didn't know, to wait there. That was all she'd been told. She was waiting. Amara's fever had broken. She had checked twice, the back of her hand against the child's forehead, the particular maternal calibration of temperature that she'd developed over 2.5 years of this. The heat was gone. Amara's breathing was slow and regular, and she was deeply asleep in the way of children whose bodies have decided the fight is over for now. Naomi sat with her and watched the corridor and tried to think clearly. She had brought her sick child into a restricted patient's room in the middle of the night. The patient had regained consciousness while the child was on his chest. There was going to be a conversation about this, and she did not know yet what kind. She turned the eviction notice over in her coat pocket without taking it out, and thought about 37 different things at once, and eventually arrived at the same place she always arrived, which was, deal with what's in front of you. Everything else is noise. At 2:50, one of the suited men appeared at the entrance to the alcove. He was younger than the others, late 20s maybe, with a face that was not unkind but was professionally careful. He spoke Korean, and she spoke enough to understand the shape of what he was asking without catching every word. She switched to English. "I understand some," she said, "but it's easier this way." He adjusted without visible irritation. "Mr. Kang is asking to see you." Naomi looked down at Amara. "She's asleep. We can arrange for someone to stay with her." "I don't leave her with people I don't know." A pause. The man recalibrated. "Then bring her. He's asking for the woman and the child." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "Does he know my name?" "He does not seem to know your name. He described you." The man paused almost imperceptibly. "He described your voice, Sat." The room had been adjusted in the time she'd been gone. The lights were slightly higher now, not bright, but no longer the near dark of the previous weeks. The cluster of equipment was the same, the lines and monitors and the soft, consistent conversation of machines. But Min-jae was elevated, the bed's head raised so that he was partially upright, and the difference between that and the total horizontal stillness she'd seen every night for 3 weeks was striking in a way that went beyond the physical. He looked at her when she came in. Still slow. Everything about him was still slow. The awakening of a man whose body had been somewhere else and had not fully returned, but direct, deliberate. She stopped at a reasonable distance from the bed, Amara against her shoulder, and looked back at him. "You're the one," he said. His English was good, better than she would have expected, accented but precise, like something he'd learned thoroughly and not recently. His voice was still damaged from disuse, low and rough-edged, but the clarity was there underneath it. Every night. "I clean the room," she said. "This floor is my assignment." "You talked." "I do that. It's a habit." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. His face seemed like a place where smiles were not regular visitors, but a slight easing of something around his eyes. "What's her name?" Naomi realized he was looking at Amara. "Amara." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I heard you say that. He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, like he was pushing against something from the inside. "I heard it." Naomi didn't say anything. She understood that she was in a situation she didn't have a map for, and that the right move was to be still and let it develop before she reacted. "She was sick," he said. "She had a fever. It's better now." "You brought her here because you had nowhere else." It wasn't a question, quite. Naomi looked at him. "I didn't have a lot of options." "You put her on my chest. I know that was—" "Don't apologize for it." He said it flat, without heat, but with enough weight that it stopped her. His eyes went back to Amara, to the small sleeping face at Naomi's shoulder, the delicate architecture of a child's features in repose. He looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Then, "What is your name?" "Naomi. Naomi Carter." "I'm Minjai." He said it without the title, without the context, just the name, like he was handing her something. "What do you need?" She blinked. "I'm sorry? You're in debt. You almost lost your job tonight. You have a sick child and no support." His eyes came back to her face. "I heard you. 3 weeks of it. What do you need?" Naomi felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a word for. Not offense exactly, not gratitude. Something more complicated. The particular discomfort of being seen clearly by someone you hadn't chosen to let see you. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I didn't say owe." His voice was still rough, but it was sharper now. More alert, more himself, whatever that was. "I said need. It's a different question." She looked at him. She looked at the tattoos on his forearms where they lay on the blanket. Those dark, intricate patterns she'd spent 3 weeks not examining too closely. She thought about the men in suits in the corridor, about the security men outside the door, about the way the night nurse had looked at his hand on her wrist. "Who are you?" she said. Not afraid. Asking. A silence. "Someone who intends to repay a debt," he said, "regardless of whether you call it that." She did not get home until nearly 5 in the morning. She took a car. One of his men arranged it, a detail she registered without fully processing, and rode back to her apartment with Amara asleep across her lap and the city going gray and pale outside the windows. The eviction notice was still in her pocket. The math was still the same. Nothing material had changed. She sat in the car and looked out at the empty early streets of Seoul and tried to understand what had happened over the last 4 hours, and couldn't make it resolve into anything coherent. A man had woken up. She had been asked to stay. He had looked at her daughter. He had asked what she needed, and she had not answered, and she had left. And she still did not know what that exchange had been, or what it was going to become. She carried Amara up 3 flights of stairs and put her to bed and stood over her for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. And then she went to the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at the eviction notice. $4,700. 15 days left in the month. She folded it in half and put it in the drawer and went to bed. The hospital became a different place over the following 72 hours. Not visibly. Not to anyone who didn't already know what to look for. The patients in the other rooms saw nothing unusual. The day staff went about their routines. Mrs. O made her rounds with her clipboard and her grievances. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hum, but the third-floor east corridor had a new texture to it. More men at the end of the hall. A rotation of faces outside 317 that was more systematic, more layered than the straightforward security presence of the previous weeks. Phones being used in the stairwell. The quiet, continuous traffic of people who moved with purpose. Min Jae was recovering faster than any of his doctors wanted to admit was possible. They hedged their language carefully. Phrases like remarkable response and unexpectedly rapid improvement, serving as the medical establishment's way of saying they didn't have a framework for what they were observing. He was speaking in full sentences by the second day, eating by the third, asking by the fourth for his phone, which he was denied by the medical team and which appeared beside his water glass anyway by the following morning. He was building a picture. Naomi understood this, in the way you understand things that are not directly said to you, but that sit in the air of a room waiting to be noticed. The men who came and went from 317 were not well-wishers. They were reporting. Min-jae was receiving information and processing it from his hospital bed with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of a man who had woken up to find his house rearranged while he slept and was conducting a careful inventory before anyone knew he'd noticed. She still cleaned the room every night. It would have been more conspicuous to stop than to continue, and besides, she examined this honestly. She was not sure she wanted to stop. Something had shifted between them in the hours after his awakening, not into anything she had a clean category for. Something more basic, the recognition, mutual and unspoken, that each of them had been present in the other's life in a way that was not formal and was not easily dismissed. She came in on the fourth night and he was sitting up without the bed's support, his back against the headboard, reading something on his phone with the intent focus she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, the total, consuming attention he brought to whatever was in front of him. He looked up when she came in. "How is she?" Naomi pulled her card inside. "Better. Fever's been gone 2 days. You should take her to a specialist, not the public clinic." "Mr. Kang, I'm told you use the children's clinic on Donghoro." She paused with her hand on the mop handle. "How do you know that?" He looked at her steadily. "I asked." "You asked?" She held his gaze. "You had someone look into me. You've been in my room for 3 weeks." His voice was level, not apologetic. "I wanted to know who." "You should have asked me. I'm asking you now." He set the phone down on the blanket. "The clinic on Donghoro has a 6-week wait for pediatric consultations and their equipment is 15 years old. I know a physician. Better location. No wait. No cost to you." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to read what was underneath the offer, not because she thought it was necessarily corrupted, but because she had lived long enough to know that gifts from powerful people were not simply gifts, and that understanding the shape of what was being extended to you was basic self-preservation. "What do you want?" she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Not offense, not calculation, something that was almost tired. "You're going to keep asking me that. You're going to keep making offers. Then maybe stop treating it like a transaction. I don't know you well enough to do that. You talked to me every night for 3 weeks. You were unconscious. I wasn't." He said it simply, and it landed in the room with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said. "Not entirely. I heard you. He pressed his lips together briefly. "All of it." Naomi set the mop down against the wall. She looked at him. "All of it," she said. "The eviction notice. The overcooked rice. The banana." He held her gaze. "Her name means Grace." The room was quiet. Outside the door, the muted sounds of the floor, the low register machinery, the distant motion of the hospital at night. "That was a private conversation," she said finally, and there was no anger in it, just truth. The observation of a woman who had learned to guard herself and had been gotten around while she wasn't looking. "I know." He didn't look away. "I wasn't supposed to hear it. You weren't talking to me." "No, but I did hear it." A pause. "And it kept me—" He stopped. His jaw worked very slightly. "Here. It kept me here." She thought about that for 3 days and then made a decision. She made it the way she made most of her important decisions, quietly, alone, in the space between putting Amara to bed and falling asleep herself. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and turned it over from every angle until the angles exhausted themselves, and what was left was the plain fact of it. He had heard everything. He had chosen to tell her. He had asked what she needed before she knew enough about him to be afraid of the answer. Whatever he was, and she was developing a clearer picture of that, from the suits and the security and the way people looked when they spoke of him, from the things she'd started to notice that she'd been consciously not noticing. He had not been dishonest with her. Not once, in any exchange she could identify. That was not nothing. She had known people who checked that box and people who didn't, and the difference mattered. She accepted the referral to the physician. The appointment was a Wednesday. The physician, a woman named Dr. An, brisk and thorough and operating out of an office in Gangnam that was demonstrably better equipped than the Dongho-ro clinic, examined Amara with the focused competence of someone who had no time to waste and billed accordingly, only in this case the billing went somewhere other than Naomi. The visit took 90 minutes. Amara got a thorough respiratory workup, blood panel, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks out. The physician handed Naomi a folder of results and said, "She's essentially healthy. The recurring fevers are likely stress-related, hers and yours." Naomi looked at her. "Mine." Dr. An looked back without flinching. Children this age are remarkably good at absorbing the ambient anxiety of their caregivers. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're under too much pressure, and she feels it. A pause. Whatever you're dealing with, try to address the source rather than the symptoms. Naomi took the folder. She thought about the eviction notice in the kitchen drawer. She thought about Min Jae in his hospital bed, building his picture, receiving his reports. She thought about the word he'd said when Ji Young had reached for her daughter. Stay. She went back to the hospital that night for her shift and found, when she arrived, that Mrs. O was waiting for her at the service entrance again. But this time, the expression on Mrs. O's face was not the practiced grievance she usually brought. It was something more uncertain, more careful. "There's been a change to your assignment," Mrs. O said. "You're being moved to a dedicated position, 3rd floor east, 1 patient." She was consulting her clipboard without looking at it, which meant she'd already read it, and the clipboard was something to do with her hands. "The terms have been renegotiated with the hospital administration. Your hourly rate is being adjusted upward, effective immediately." Naomi stood at the service entrance in the light rain and looked at her supervisor. "How much upward?" Mrs. O told her the number. Naomi kept her face very still. It was just above $4,700 a month. It was enough. It was exactly enough. "Who arranged this?" she said. Mrs. O looked at her for a moment with an expression that was equal parts wariness and the grudging recognition of a woman who understood the exercise of power even when she didn't like who was exercising it. "I wasn't told the specifics." Naomi nodded. She went inside. She went up to the 3rd floor. She passed the men in suits in the corridor. She went into room 317 and found Min Jae awake, which he always was now, sitting up in the elevated bed with his phone and the flat, patient focus she was learning to read. He looked up. She stood just inside the door and looked at him for a moment. "You adjusted my pay rate," she said. The hospital administration agreed that the position warranted better compensation. "Through what leverage?" He met her eyes, said nothing. She stepped into the room, let the door close behind her. "You don't get to manage my life." "I renegotiated a wage agreement. It's my life." She said it evenly, but with enough underneath it that he heard it. "I've been managing it without help for a long time, and I'm capable of—" "I know you're capable." The words came out with a directness that stopped her. Not loud, not defensive, just clear. "That is not the point. The point is that you shouldn't have to spend this much effort just staying above water. You have a daughter. That should not require this much—" He stopped. His hand was on the blanket, and the fingers had tightened slightly, the same unconscious compression she'd noticed before when he was working against the full weight of something. "I'm not trying to manage you. I'm trying to—" He exhaled. "I don't have a word for what I'm doing that you'll accept." Naomi looked at him. She took her time. "Try anyway," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then the door to room 317 opened without a knock, and the man who stepped through it was not a doctor or a nurse or one of the suited security detail, and the expression he wore when he looked from Min Jae to Naomi and back again contained something that did not belong in a room this size. Park Jun-seok stood in the doorway with his hawk lapel pin and his concrete jaw and his flat, appraising eyes, and he smiled the smile of a man who had just been handed information he intended to use, and he said, in English, looking directly at Naomi, "So this is the cleaning woman. I've been wondering." Min Jae had gone completely still. The kind of still that was not calm, the kind that came just before something. The smile on Jun-seok's face was the kind that had nothing to do with warmth. It was a tool, a specific instrument deployed for a specific purpose. And the purpose right now was to establish, in the first 3 seconds of entering a room, exactly who held the power in it. Min-jae did not move. He sat in the elevated bed with his hands on the blanket and his eyes on Jun Seok, and the stillness around him had changed quality. It was no longer the stillness of a man conserving strength. It was the stillness of a man deciding. Naomi stood between them without meaning to, and felt the temperature of the room change in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had grown up in neighborhoods where she'd learned early to read the space between two men before either of them moved. And what she was reading right now made her want to pick up her daughter and walk backward through a wall. Amara wasn't here. That was the one thing working in her favor. Jun Seok, Min-jae said. Just the name. Flat. The way you'd say a word in a language you decided to stop speaking. Boss? Jun Seok stepped into the room and let the door close behind him. His eyes moved to Naomi with the particular attention of a man cataloging a variable. You look better. The doctor said another week minimum before you'd be coherent. You've always been stubborn about schedules. Why are you here? To see how you're recovering, obviously. He moved to the chair beside the bed, the chair where Naomi usually sat, and lowered himself into it with the comfort of someone who considered the space already his. He looked at Naomi again. You should probably go. She stays, Min-jae said. Jun Seok's eyes returned to him. Something passed between them. Fast, compressed, the kind of communication that had years of history underneath it. Jun Seok's smile didn't change, but his eyes did, very slightly. Of course, he said. He folded his hands in his lap. Then let's talk. Naomi moved to the window and stood with her back to the glass and watched them. She understood she was being left in the room as a deliberate choice, that Min-jae had said she stays for reasons that had nothing to do with her comfort, and everything to do with something she didn't have the full picture of yet. She was a variable, too. She just didn't know in which equation. Jun Seok began speaking in Korean. His tone was measured, deferential in its surface structure, the language of a subordinate reporting to a superior. But underneath it, in the rhythm and the pauses, there was something else, something that was performing deference rather than feeling it. Min-jae listened without interrupting. His face gave nothing away. His right hand lay flat on the blanket and his fingers were very still. Jun Seok spoke for approximately 4 minutes. Then he stopped and waited. Min-jae said in English, which was, Naomi understood, a choice. Tell me about the night of the 14th. Jun Seok's expression shifted by a fraction. I've given you the full report. Give it to me again. Min-jae, again. In English this time. For clarity. A pause. Jun Seok looked at Naomi. You want to have this conversation in front of a hospital worker. I want to have this conversation in a language where I can hear the parts you change. The silence that followed that sentence had weight to it. Jun Seok looked at Min-jae for a long moment, and the smile was gone now, and what was underneath it was less readable. A flat, patient, calculating nothing that was somehow more concerning than whatever it had been covering. The intelligence was bad, Jun Seok said. His English was precise and unaccented, which surprised Naomi despite herself. The contact in Busan gave us a location. I sent the security detail based on that intelligence. By the time we understood the location was compromised. You sent 2 men, Min-jae said. Standard protocol for... My standard protocol is 6. You know that. You wrote the protocol. Jun Seok was quiet. 2 men is not a protection detail, Min-jae said. 2 men is a gesture. 2 men is something you send when you want it to look like you tried. The room was very still. Naomi was not breathing loudly. She was barely breathing at all. You're saying I set you up. Jun Seok's voice was careful, not quite denying, framing the accusation so he could respond to the frame rather than the content. I'm saying 2 men. Min-jae's eyes hadn't moved. I want you to explain 2 men to me. Take your time. Basid, Jun Seok explained. The explanation was detailed and internally consistent and contained the right amount of self-criticism, acknowledging the failure of the intelligence chain while distributing responsibility across 3 people who were not in the room. It was a good explanation. Naomi, who had no framework for this world and was building one in real time, could tell it was a good explanation by the way it moved, smoothly, without catching on anything, like a piece of furniture that had been measured precisely for the space it needed to fit. Min-jae listened to all of it. Then he said, Lee Sung-han. Something happened to Jun Seok's face. Too small to name, too fast to catch completely. But it happened. What about him? Jun Seok said. He was the third man in the Busan contact chain. You didn't mention him. He's not relevant to... He's dead. Min-jae said it without inflection. He died 4 days after I was admitted here. Respiratory failure, the report says. Lee Sung-han was 38 years old and had no history of respiratory problems. He paused. Who signed off on his medical assessment? I don't shut... The name on the form is Choi. Dr. Choi Byung-woo. He's been on our payroll for 11 years. I know his signature. The signature on Lee Sung-han's form is not his signature. A pause. It's close, but it's not his. The air in the room changed. Jun Seok sat in the chair and looked at Min-jae, and the performance of subordination was entirely gone now. What was left was something quieter and more honest and considerably more dangerous. You've been awake 4 days, Jun Seok said. I've been awake 4 days, Min-jae agreed. You shouldn't be able to... No. Min-jae's voice dropped slightly. Not louder, heavier. You had 3 weeks. You should have used them better. Jun Seok left 20 minutes later. He stood and straightened his jacket, and his expression had been reconstructed into something professionally neutral, and he nodded once to Min-jae and did not look at Naomi at all on his way out, which she understood was its own kind of message, the deliberate erasure of someone from your field of attention because you've already decided what you're going to do about them. The door closed. Naomi stayed at the window. The city was visible behind her, gray morning soul pressing its indifference against the glass. Min-jae sat in the bed and stared at the closed door, and the flatness in his eyes was something she had not seen from him before. Not anger, something past anger, something that had already processed the emotional content and come out the other side into pure cold function. He did it, she said. She didn't say it as a question. Yes. You knew before he walked in. I knew before he walked in. He said it without satisfaction, like confirming a measurement. I needed to see what he'd do with the 2 men question, how he'd handle it, whether he'd changed his story or was still running the original version. Still running it. He's confident, Min-jae said. He believes I'm too weak to move yet. He thinks he has time. He paused. He's wrong about the time. Naomi looked at him. At the tattoos on his forearms and the IV still running into the back of his left hand and the hospital gown and the monitors and the bed he was still technically confined to. The gap between what he looked like and what she was understanding him to be was dizzying. What happens now? She said. He looked at her then, pulled back from wherever he'd been. Nothing that involves you. He saw my face. A beat. Something tightened around Min-jae's eyes. He saw my face in your room, she said, keeping her voice level. He knows I've been here every night. He knows... She stopped, started again. He knows you said I stay. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. I'll make sure... Don't tell me you'll make sure, she said. Not loud, not angry, but direct in a way she'd been building toward for days without knowing it. Don't manage this for me. Tell me what it means. What does it mean that he saw me? Min-jae looked at her. He did not, she noticed, look away from the question or find a softer version of it to answer instead. He held it. He said, It means he'll want to know how much you know. I don't know anything. That doesn't matter to people like him. Potential is the same as fact. You're in this room. You're important to me. He said the last part without pausing around it, without softening it or qualifying it, just laid it there plain. That makes you a variable he'll want to control. Control how? Leverage or removal. He said it the same way you'd say either word in a sentence about office furniture. And then, because he was watching her face, I'm sorry, she looked at him. For what part? For the position you're in. His jaw tightened slightly. You didn't choose this. No, she agreed. I chose to talk to a patient. I chose to bring my sick daughter somewhere safe. Those were my choices. Everything else... She looked at the door Jun Seok had walked out of. Everything else followed. But she went home at 6 in the morning and stood in Amara's doorway for a long time watching her daughter sleep. Amara was on her back with both arms flung out to the sides in the total physical surrender of early childhood sleep, her face slack and perfect and completely unguarded. The morning light was coming in around the curtain edges and falling across the blanket in thin, pale bars. Naomi stood there and looked at her daughter and felt the specific fear that had no name. Not the fear of something that had happened, but of something that was coming and that she could not yet see the shape of. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She sat at the table with the eviction notice still in the drawer. She hadn't needed to look at it again. The number was in her head permanently now. And she thought about what Min-jae had said, about leverage or removal, delivered in the same tone, about the way Jun Seok had looked at her, that deliberate erasure, the decision already made behind flat eyes. She thought about Min-jae's hand coming off that blanket, that slow, effortful, purposeful motion, the grip on Ji-young's wrist, the word, stay. She thought about the physician's folder in her bag, about Amar's blood panel and the follow-up appointment, and the word stress-related, hers and yours. She put her hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. She made a decision. It was not a comfortable decision. It was the decision available to her, which was different. Tucked. She came back that night and Min-jae was not alone. There were 3 men in the room she hadn't seen before. Not suits, not hospital staff, something in between. They stood at different points in the room in a configuration that was not accidental, and when she came in with her cart, they assessed her quickly and then looked to Min-jae, who nodded once, and they gave her space without leaving. Min-jae looked worse than he had that morning. Not medically worse. His color was better, his eyes clearer. But the weariness underneath it had deepened. The weariness of someone who had been working very hard in a very small space and was starting to feel the walls. "Your number," he said when she was inside. "Jun Seok has it." She stopped. "How?" "Mrs. O." He said it without accusation, just fact. "She was asked questions this morning. She answered them. She doesn't know she did anything wrong. He's subtle." Naomi set the mop handle against the wall very carefully and stood with her hands at her sides and made herself breathe. "What did he ask?" "Your schedule. Your home address." A pause that had something underneath it. "Whether you had family and soul." The kitchen table. Amara's arms flung wide in sleep, the thin bars of morning light. "My daughter," she said. "He doesn't know about her yet." Min-jae's voice was controlled, but the effort of controlling it was visible in a way it hadn't been before. "That's still contained, but it won't stay contained if I need to get her out of the apartment." "Yes?" "Tonight." "Yes?" He looked at her directly. "I have a place. Safe. Staff I trust. She would be. I'm not sending her somewhere without me." "Then both of you." No hesitation, no negotiation. "Both of you tonight. Don't go back to the apartment after your shift. I'll have someone meet you at the service entrance." Naomi looked at him. She looked at the 3 men in the room. She looked at the monitors and the IV and the hospital bed and the man in it who had been trying, she understood, to protect her from this conversation for as long as he could and had run out of time. "You should have told me sooner," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that privately. "Yes," he said, "I should have." It was the answer she hadn't expected. No justification, no qualification. Just acknowledgement, clean and direct, and it hit her differently than an explanation would have. She picked up the mop. She started to work, because the room still needed cleaning, and her hands needed to be doing something, and after a moment she said quietly, "The apartment has a leak under the kitchen sink. I never got it fixed. I always thought I'd have more time." Min-jae watched her work. The monitors kept their rhythm. One of the 3 men near the door shifted his weight slightly. "You'll have more time," Min-jae said. She didn't answer. She was almost done with the section near the window when her phone buzzed against her hip. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She didn't answer it. It buzzed again. Same number. She let it go. The third buzz was a text. She looked at it for 3 full seconds without her face changing. Then she put the phone in her pocket and finished the section she was working on with the same steady, methodical strokes she always used. She turned to Min-jae. "My sitter just messaged," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "She says there are 2 men sitting in a car outside my building. They've been there for an hour. She's watching them from her window." Naomi set the mop down. Her hands were completely still. "She has Amara tonight." The room changed. The 3 men who had been standing at different points were suddenly less distributed. A subtle collective shift, a realignment, the kind of physical reorganization that happened below the level of conscious decision. Min-jae was already reaching for his phone. "Get her out of there," Naomi said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Only slightly, only for a half second, but it cracked, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a single breath and then looked back at him. "Please, get my daughter out of there right now." Min-jae was already speaking into the phone in rapid Korean, his voice stripped of everything but function, and the three men were already moving, and in the corridor outside there were footsteps, fast ones, and Naomi stood in the middle of room 317 with her hands at her sides and her heart in her throat, and understood, with the full weight of it settling into her body all at once, that she had walked into something she could not walk back out of, and that her daughter was somewhere in this city in the dark with... The phone call lasted 4 minutes. Naomi stood in the center of room 317 and listened to Min-jae speak and watched his face and learned things about him in those 4 minutes that 3 weeks of nightly conversation had not taught her. The voice on the phone was not the voice he used with her. It was lower, more compressed, stripped of everything that wasn't instruction. He spoke in Korean, but the tone needed no translation. It was the tone of a man who had spent decades being the last word in a room, who had built an entire architecture of power on the understanding that when he spoke, things happened, and who was now spending that architecture in one concentrated expenditure because the situation required it. He hung up. He looked at her. "My man is 4 minutes from your sitter's building. She needs to take Amara out the back. Service stairs, not the elevator. There's a gray vehicle." He said the plate number once, clearly. "She shows the driver this." He held up his phone so she could see the screen, a single character, a symbol she didn't recognize. "She shows him that. He takes them somewhere safe. I need you to call her now and tell her to move." Naomi already had her phone out. She called Mrs. Yoon and spoke for 45 seconds in the fast, quiet, absolutely controlled voice of a woman who understood that panic was a transmission that traveled directly from adult to child, and that her daughter was on the other end of this chain, and that the chain needed to hold. Mrs. Yoon said she understood. Naomi said she trusted her. She hung up. She looked at Min-jae. 4 minutes. 3 now. She put the phone in her pocket and stood there, and the waiting was the worst thing she had ever done. She understood this was not rational. She had been through worse waiting, objectively, the long medical waits, the financial waits, the waiting that stretched across years. But this waiting was different because it was compressed into minutes, and she could feel every second of it in her sternum like something being tightened. One of the 3 men in the room said something to Min-jae. Min-jae responded without looking away from Naomi. The man left. "The 2 men outside her building," Naomi said. "Are they going to—" "My people will be there first." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "They're watching, not moving yet. Junseok is careful. He doesn't move until he's certain." "Certain of what?" "Certain that I'm still too weak to respond." Something moved behind his eyes. He's been miscalculating that for 4 days. Her phone buzzed. She had it out before the second vibration. Mrs. Yoon's text. "We're moving. Backstairs. She's asking for you." Naomi read it twice, put the phone away, breathed. "She's moving," she said. Min-jae nodded. He was already on his own phone again, and she could see in the angle of his shoulders and the set of his jaw that whatever he was now doing was something he had been building toward since the moment he opened his eyes 4 days ago. Not just the protection of her daughter, but something larger, something that had been assembling itself in the background while Junseok walked the hospital corridors in his good suit and believed he was managing the timeline. 40 minutes later, Mrs. Yoon sent a photo. Naomi looked at it for a long time. It was a small room, clean, warm-lit, simply furnished, and Amara was on a low bed with a stuffed animal that was not her elephant and was clearly a substitute that someone had found quickly, and her eyes were open but heavy, and she was looking at the camera with the particular expression of a child who had been moved around too much tonight and was past asking why, and had arrived at the exhausted acceptance that her mother knew things she didn't and was coming. Naomi sat down in the chair beside Min-jae's bed. She looked at the photo for another moment, and then put the phone away and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she dropped her hands and sat up straight and looked at the wall. "She's okay," she said, to herself as much as him. Yes, he was watching her, not with the clinical detachment she might have expected from a man managing a tactical situation, with something more direct than that, and less comfortable, and more honest. "Your people," she said. "In that building with my daughter. I don't know them. I know. I don't know if I can. You can check on her any time. Call Mrs. Yoon. Call the number I'll give you for the man in the building. You have access to her every minute. He paused. I understand what I'm asking you to trust. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to trust what I've done so far. She looked at him. She thought about the physician's folder, the adjusted pay rate, the car at 5 in the morning, the 4-minute phone call. She didn't say anything, but she stayed in the chair, and he understood what that meant. At midnight, Park Jun-seok made his move. It did not look like a move at first. It looked like a visit. He arrived at the hospital in a car that parked in the public lot, walked through the main entrance with one other man, signed in at the reception desk with his own name, the confidence of someone who did not expect to need deniability, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The duty nurse at the station saw him come and reach for the phone. She did not complete the call. The man with Jun-seok was not large. He was medium everything, medium height, medium build, forgettable face, the physical anonymity of someone who had spent years cultivating it. He put his hand on the desk phone with a gesture that was almost gentle. The nurse looked at the hand and then at his face and made the correct assessment and put her own hands in her lap. Jun-seok walked toward room 317. He passed the first checkpoint, the regular security men who had been there all month, who knew his face, who stepped aside because he had always stepped through and nothing had ever indicated they should stop him. He was 12 feet from the door when Min Jae's men moved. There were 4 of them. They had been in the corridor for 6 hours in configurations that looked like hospital visitors, like maintenance workers, like a man making a phone call near the window. They materialized from these positions with the kind of coordinated efficiency that didn't require signals because the signals had been agreed upon hours ago, and they put themselves between Jun-seok and the door with a finality that was physical but had not yet become violent. Jun-seok stopped. He looked at the 4 men. He looked at the door, then he smiled. The same smile from that morning. The tool. I'm just visiting my boss, he said pleasantly. The man directly in front of him, broad, late 30s, a scar running through his left eyebrow that had not come from a kitchen accident, looked at him without expression and said nothing. He asked to see me, Jun-seok continued. I have a message for him. Business. Nothing. Jun-seok's smile held for another 2 seconds. Then it changed. Not disappearing, but transforming, the pleasantness peeling back to reveal something underneath that had always been there and had simply stopped needing cover. You understand, he said, quietly now, to no one in particular, that this is temporary. Whatever he's built in there, in 4 days from a hospital bed. A pause. He's not well. He won't be well for weeks, and in weeks... He stopped himself. He was already talking to people who worked for the man he was describing, which meant he was either very confident or had already decided this conversation was a formality. The door to room 317 opened. Min Jae stood in the doorway. Not in the bed, not elevated against pillows. Standing. He was in the hospital gown and his feet were bare on the linoleum, and the IV had been removed from the back of his hand, leaving a small dark puncture mark, and he was holding the doorframe with his right hand in a way that suggested the standing was costing him something. But he was standing, and the expression on his face looking at Jun-seok was the distilled product of 20 years of knowing exactly what this man was and 3 weeks of lying in the dark, listening to his own empire being quietly dismantled. Jun-seok's smile disappeared entirely. Come in, Min Jae said. Naomi was inside the room. She had been told to stay near the window, and she had stayed near the window. And now she watched Jun-seok walk past Min Jae into the room with the careful, recalibrated movement of a man who had just had his estimate of the situation revised significantly upward. Min Jae let go of the doorframe and turned and walked back to the bed. The walk was measured and deliberate and cost him visibly. She could see it in the slight stiffness of his movement, in the jaw set, in the way he managed the transition from standing to sitting against the bed's edge with a control that was not quite effortless, but was not going to show her or Jun-seok or anyone else that it was difficult. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Jun-seok and waited. Jun-seok looked at Naomi. Why is she still here? She works here. Min Jae's voice was flat. Talk. This is an internal matter. Everything is internal. She stays. Talk. Jun-seok turned back to him. The tool was entirely gone now, and what remained was something unprocessed and direct, and considerably easier to read. You've been busy, he said. 4 days. You've been redirecting assets, talking to people, pulling files. His voice had dropped to something almost conversational. You know what I find interesting? You haven't called the council. You haven't made any official move to reassert your position. You're doing everything quietly. He tilted his head slightly. Why quietly, Min-jae? Min-jae said nothing. Because you're not sure who else knew, Jun-seok said. He said it with the satisfaction of someone laying down a card. You don't know how deep it goes. You don't know which of the council members I'd spoken to before the 14th. You don't know who was waiting to see which way it went. He paused. So you're quiet. You're careful. You're rebuilding from the inside out because you can't trust the structure. He let that sit. Which means you're more isolated than you're letting on. The room was very still. You came here to tell me that, Min-jae said. I came here to offer you a solution. Jun-seok's voice shifted again. Smoother now, the register of a negotiation. You step back. Medical grounds. Temporary. You maintain the title, the face of it. I run operations. Clean transition, no war, no bodies, no disruption to revenue. He spread his hands slightly. Everyone survives. Including you. Including everyone. That's the point. Min-jae looked at him for a long, flat moment. Then he said, Lee Sung-han. Jun-seok's composure held, but it held the way a surface holds when there's pressure under it, visibly. Lee he had a daughter, 8 years old. He sent her pictures every week. He kept them in his phone. Min-jae's voice had not risen. It was, if anything, quieter than before. I know, because I've seen his phone. My people recovered it before your people could get to it. A pause. The pictures are still there. Every week for 3 years. Same little girl, different haircut. Jun-seok said nothing. He told you something, Min-jae said. That's why he's dead. He found out something about the 14th, and he told you, thinking you'd tell me, because for 11 years that was how it worked. He trusted the chain. His eyes hadn't moved from Jun-seok's face. You had him killed in a hospital and signed a dead doctor's name to the form. And his daughter is 8 years old, and she still doesn't know why her father stopped sending pictures. The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before it. Heavier, more honest. Your offer, Min-jae said. Step back. Medical grounds. You run operations. He let one beat pass. No. Jun-seok looked at him. The negotiation register was gone. You're in a hospital bed. Yes. You have 4 men in a corridor. Among other things. You don't know who on the council. I know enough. Min-jae's hand came off the bed edge where he'd been bracing it, and he straightened slightly. Just slightly. Just enough to change the geometry of who was standing and who was sitting and what that meant. I know Choi and Beck are yours. I know Lim is waiting to see. I know the other 4 are mine, have always been mine, and are currently waiting for a phone call that I have not made yet because I wanted to have this conversation first. He held Jun-seok's gaze. Out of respect for 11 years. Something happened to Jun-seok's face. Not the controlled adjustments of before, something less managed. The particular expression of a man who has walked into a room believing he held the better hand and has just watched the other player turn over his cards. You had all of this, Jun-seok said. 4 days. 3 weeks of dark and a very quiet room. Min-jae glanced at Naomi, fast, barely a second, and back. I had time to think. Jun-seok stood very still. The quality of the stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a man conserving himself for a better moment. It was the stillness of a man recalculating in real time, running through options that were closing faster than he could open new ones. His jaw was tight. There was something working behind his eyes that was moving too fast to read. You're going to bring this to the council, he said. Yes. Formal proceeding. Evidence review. Yes. Jun-seok was quiet for a moment. Then, and the woman. He looked at Naomi with the deliberate weight of someone deploying a variable he's kept in reserve. She's been in this room for weeks. She knows things she shouldn't. She's a liability you're creating by, she's not your concern. Min-jae said it without heat and without any particular emphasis, and it was somehow more definitive for the lack of both. She's an exposure point. She is not your concern. Repeated. Exactly the same. The second time, not a restatement, but a wall. Jun-seok looked at Naomi for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was long enough to say what he needed to say without words. Then he looked back at Min Jae. You're making a personal attachment, a strategic decision. I'm making every decision I make, Min Jae said, same as always. This is different. Yes. No qualification, no apology for it. Jun Seok straightened his jacket. The hawk pin on his lapel caught the low light. The council meets in 6 days. I'll have lawyers. Bring them. You should know. He paused. He seemed to be selecting something, choosing carefully from among the things available to him. The men outside her building, the ones you moved her to avoid. He stopped. Naomi's heart rate changed. Those weren't my men, Jun-seok said. The room shifted. Min Jae's expression didn't change, but something in his body changed. The same tightening she'd seen before, and the fingers on the blanket, but now larger, more systemic. His eyes stayed on Jun-seok's face, and his voice when he spoke was very controlled and very quiet. Say that again. The men outside the building. Jun-seok met his gaze. I had her sitter's address. I was watching the building, yes, but those 2 men in the car. He held the pause for exactly long enough. I don't know who they are. I assumed they were yours. The silence after that was of a different kind entirely. Min Jae's jaw was tight. His eyes had gone somewhere that was not this room, working through implications with the rapid, invisible intensity of a man who has just been handed a piece of information that doesn't fit the puzzle he thought he was solving. Jun-seok looked at him, and then at Naomi, and then, for the last time, at the door. 6 days, he said. Council session. He walked out. The door closed. Min Jae had the phone to his ear before the click of the latch had finished. He was speaking fast and low, and the Korean was too rapid for Naomi to follow, but she caught the tone, and the tone was not controlled anymore. Or it was controlled in the way that high pressure was controlled, held inside a container at considerable cost. She stood at the window and looked at the city and thought about 2 men in a car that were not Jun-seok's. About who else knew enough about her to post a watch outside her building. About what she and Amara represented in an equation that she had thought was between Min Jae and his second-in-command, and that was apparently larger than that. Larger than Jun-seok, larger than the council, larger than the hospital corridor, and the men in suits, and everything she had been trying to understand for the past 4 days. Min Jae lowered the phone. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he was processing something, and not ready to process it out loud. The flat, internal quality. The working machinery behind still eyes. Tell me, she said. He exhaled through his nose. He looked at the phone in his hand. The men outside the building are a crew from Busan. Not mine. Not Jun-seok's, he paused. They work for a man named Dae-young. Hwang Dae-young. He looked up. He's the one who gave Jun-seok the bad intelligence for the 14th. Naomi stood very still. So Jun-seok didn't arrange the hit on me. Min Jae's voice was absolutely level and absolutely cold. He was given bad intelligence by someone who did. He sent 2 men because 2 men was what the intelligence justified. A routine location, a safe meeting. He was used. A pause. The same as me. The room realigned itself around this information. Everything she had understood for the past week shifted. Not disappeared, not invalidated, but rotated to a different angle, revealing a different shape. Hwang Dae-young, she said. He's been trying to move into Seoul for 2 years. He needed me out of the way, and he needed someone internal to take the fall for it. He gave Jun-seok information that would get me killed and leave Jun-seok holding the blame. Min Jae set the phone down on the bed beside him. His hand was not completely steady. And then he put men on your building, because he knows. His eyes found hers. He knows you matter. She heard the words. She heard what they meant in the tactical sense. She also heard everything else they contained, and she didn't address either of those things directly, because this was not the moment and she knew it. Where is Amara? She said. Safe house on the east side, 12 minutes from here. I have 4 people in the building. Hwang's men don't have that address. Yet. He stood up from the bed's edge. The standing cost him again, and he absorbed the cost without showing it and moved to the chair. Not to sit, but to brace against it, to be upright, to be as close to functional as his body would currently allow. I need to move you tonight, both of you, different location. How many safe houses do you have? Enough. Min Jae. She said his name the way she'd started saying it, without the distance of Mr. Kang, without the formality, and it did what it always did, which was pull his full attention to her face. How many people does this Huang have in Seoul? He looked at her for a moment. More than I currently know about. And the council meeting is in 6 days. Yes. And until then, you're managing this from a hospital room. He was quiet. You can't do this from a hospital room, she said. Not accusation, assessment. I know. Then you need to leave. I know. He said it with the particular weight of a man who has known something for days and has been negotiating against it because the knowing was inconvenient and now has run out of room to negotiate. My medical team will. I'm not talking about your medical team. I'm talking about... She stopped. She looked at him. He was pale under the recovery color, and there was a faint dampness at his temple, and his hand on the back of the chair had tightened to the point where the knuckles had changed color. He was upright through will rather than capacity, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to say it. I'm talking about what it costs you to wait 6 more days in here, she said, and what it costs everyone else. His phone buzzed on the bed. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face, fast, sharp, and controlled into nothing within a second. But she was close enough, and she had been watching his face for weeks, and she caught it. What? She said. He looked up at her. He held the phone so she could see the screen. The text was from the man guarding the safe house. 3 words and a set of coordinates. They found it. Naomi looked at the coordinates and then at Min Jae, and in the space of that look, something passed between them that was not a decision yet, but was the breath just before. He was already moving before she finished reading the screen. Not fast. His body wouldn't allow fast, not yet. Not with 4 bullets worth of damage still knitting itself back together underneath the hospital gown, but with the particular directed momentum of a man who has accepted that waiting is no longer a variable. He crossed to the small closet where his personal effects had been stored and pulled out a bag that someone had brought in the last 48 hours. And from it he took clothes, dark, unremarkable, the clothes of a man who didn't want to be looked at. And he dressed with the economical focus of someone managing pain by not acknowledging it. Naomi watched him for 3 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called the guard at the safe house. He answered on the first ring. She could hear something in the background, not chaos, not yet, but the tightened quality of a situation about to become one. She asked for Amara. There was a pause of 4 seconds that felt architectural, like the pause was holding something up. Then she heard her daughter's voice, small, confused, not crying but close to it, and the relief that moved through her was so physical she had to put one hand on the windowsill. Mama? I'm coming, baby. Stay with Mrs. Yoon. Stay inside. I'm coming. She hung up. Min Jae was buttoning his shirt with hands that were not quite steady and not quite unstable, somewhere in the narrow band between them, managed. He had not asked for help, and she did not offer it. How many men can you move in the next 10 minutes? She said. 6 here. More at the secondary location. He tucked the shirt in, moved to the door, said something through it in Korean, came back. We have maybe 20 minutes before Huang's people decide waiting is no longer useful. What does that mean? He looked at her. It means they've been watching to see if I'd come to her. If I moved toward the safe house, they'd have a location on me. They want me and Amara in the same place. The calculation of it landed in her chest like something cold. They were using her as bait. They were creating an incentive. His voice was flat, but she heard what was underneath it, not identical to her feeling, but adjacent to it, close enough that she recognized the shape. It means they understand what she is to me, which means Junseok told them more than I'd calculated. Or they've been watching longer than you knew. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, she picked up her coat. Then we go. You're not... She's my daughter. She said it without volume, without argument, just the plain, irreducible weight of it. I'm not waiting here. He looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she understood he was running the alternatives and not finding any that worked better. Then he nodded once. Stay close, he said. Do exactly what I say when I say it. No delays. Yes. If something happens, nothing is going to happen. Naomi. She met his eyes. Tell me. If something happens, my man Cha will get you and Amara out. You don't wait for me. You go. He held her gaze. Do you understand? She understood. She didn't like it. She said, yes. They went. The hospital's service exit opened onto a side street that was empty at this hour. 2 in the morning, the city in its brief daily pause. The Han River a dark suggestion 3 blocks east. 3 vehicles were waiting, engines running, positioned the way vehicles position themselves when the people inside them have thought about multiple exit scenarios. Minji got into the middle car without breaking stride. Naomi got in beside him. The driver didn't speak, didn't look back. He pulled into the street and drove with the practiced ease of a man who had done this specific kind of driving before and knew what it required. The city moved past the windows. Naomi watched it and kept her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Beside her, Min-jae had his phone out, receiving information in pieces, short messages, acknowledged with single words or silence. And she could see him building the picture in real time, the same way he'd been building it from the hospital bed, adding layers, adjusting, recalculating. They have 3 men at the building's front entrance, he said quietly. 2 more at the parking structure. The ones who found the safe house. He paused. They're waiting. For you. For both of us. Together. He looked at the phone. They want it clean. 1 location, 1 action. How many people do you have? Enough. He said it the same way he'd said it before, and this time she understood it wasn't evasion. It was the honest answer of a man who had learned not to make promises in arithmetical terms because arithmetic had a way of becoming irrelevant. The council members I trust have been contacted. There are people moving toward Huang's known locations in the city. This ends tonight regardless of the safe house. But I need... He stopped. You need to get to her first, Naomi said. I need them to see me come for her, he said. I need that to be the last mistake they make. She looked at him in the passing streetlight. The angular face and the careful stillness and the thing underneath it that had been underneath it since the first night she'd looked at him in that hospital room and felt the armor slip. The man who had woken up reaching for something he hadn't been able to name. The man who had heard 3 weeks of her life through the dark and held on to it. She didn't say anything. She looked back out at the city. The building was a converted residential tower in a neighborhood that was transitional in the way of many Seoul neighborhoods. Old structures between new ones, the past and present in uncomfortable adjacency. The safe house was on the 7th floor. The 3 men at the front entrance were not conspicuous to anyone who didn't know what they were, which was most people. Naomi knew what they were. Min-jae's cars pulled up 1 block east, out of sightlines. He sat in the vehicle for 30 seconds with his phone, and in those 30 seconds things happened in other parts of the city. She understood this without seeing it, from the tightening of the driver's posture and the sequence of messages arriving on Min-jae's screen. Pieces of a mechanism she couldn't fully observe engaging in order. Huang's main operation, Min-jae said. Warehouse District Mapo. My people have it surrounded. He looked up from the phone. We move now, while he's managing that. And the men at this building. Being handled. He looked at her. I need you to stay in the vehicle until Amara is on the 7th floor. Until I tell you it's clear. He held her eyes. 3 minutes. Give me 3 minutes. She looked at him. His color was wrong. Too pale, the exertion of getting dressed and getting into a car already visible in the tight set of his jaw and the slight dampness at his hairline. He had 4 bullets worth of recent surgery in his body, and he was asking her for 3 minutes so he could walk into a building with armed men in it. 3 minutes, she said. Then I'm coming regardless. He got out of the car. Okay. She watched the building entrance. The driver watched with her, a shared silence that needed no conversation. 1 minute passed. 2. She had her hand on the door handle. A sound from inside the building. Not a gunshot, something duller, something that didn't carry. Then quiet. The front entrance cleared. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't know. Cha. 2 words. Floor clear. She was out of the car and moving. The lobby was empty in the particular way of a space that had recently contained something it no longer contained. She didn't look at the details. She went to the stairs because waiting for an elevator was not something her body would agree to, and took them at a pace that was faster than a walk and not quite running, and by the 4th floor her lungs were discussing this decision with her, and she didn't negotiate with them. 7th floor, the corridor. A door halfway down with a man outside it, one of Min-jae's, she recognized the face from the hospital, who stepped aside when he saw her. She pushed the door open. Mrs. Yoon was in the corner with her arms around Amara, both of them on the floor against the wall in the instinctive crouch of people who'd been told to stay low. Amara heard the door and looked up, and the expression that crossed her daughter's face was the single most valuable thing Naomi had seen in her adult life. The particular transformation of a frightened child's features when the specific person they need most walks through the door. Mama. She crossed the room and took her daughter and held her with the totality of someone who had spent the last 3 hours calculating the cost of this moment and now did not calculate anything at all. Amara's arms went around her neck and her legs went around her waist, and the small body pressed into her with the physical urgency of a child communicating something that had no words, only weight. "I've got you," Naomi said into her daughter's hair. "I've got you. We're going." She looked up. Min-jae was in the doorway. His right hand was against the doorframe, and he was breathing in the controlled, effortful way of a man managing significant pain with the tool of his will. There was a cut on his left forearm that had been dealt with minimally, wrapped, not cleaned, and beneath the wrapping, a dark stain. He was looking at Naomi and Amara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not softness, exactly. Not sentiment. Something more stripped than either of those. The expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life building structures to protect himself from wanting specific things, and has had that architecture finally, irreversibly, come down. Amara turned her head from her mother's shoulder and looked at him. She had seen him once before, asleep, in a dark room, as a sick toddler. She had no conscious memory of it, but something in the way she looked at him now was not afraid, which was unusual for a 2.5-year-old confronted by a large, unfamiliar man in a doorway in the middle of the night. She looked at him with the direct, unmediated assessment of very young children who had not yet learned to decorate their perceptions. Then she held out her hand toward him, just the gesture, the small arm extended, the open fingers. The gesture children made when they wanted to be acknowledged. Min-jae looked at the outstretched hand for a moment. Then he crossed the room and took it, very carefully, in 2 fingers. Amara's hand closed around them, and she looked at the tattoos on his forearm with focused 2-year-old interest, tracing one edge of a dragon with her fingernail the way she might trace a picture in a book. Nobody in the room said anything. Hwang Dae-young was taken at the Mapo warehouse at 3:17 in the morning. Naomi learned this later, in pieces, over days. She learned it the way she learned most things about this world, not through direct report, but through inference, through the way information arrived in fragments, and the fragments assembled themselves into a picture if you were patient. Hwang had underestimated several things. He'd underestimated how much of the soul infrastructure was still functionally Min-jae's after 3 weeks. He'd underestimated the speed of 4 days of recovery. And he had catastrophically underestimated the particular motivated clarity of a man who had woken up from near death with a specific reason to stay. The council session happened. Not in 6 days, in 4, emergency convened, the kind of session that happened when the alternative was open war in the streets of a city that could not contain it. Naomi was not there. She was in a different building with Amara and Mrs. Yoon and a physician who had been called at 4 in the morning without complaint, checking Amara for the 3rd time in 24 hours and finding her, as before, essentially healthy. Minji came back at 7 in the morning. He knocked. He always knocked now, she noticed, even though it was his building and his door. And when she opened it, he looked like a man who had driven a very long distance and was considering whether to get out of the car. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. The cut on his forearm had been properly dressed. He'd changed clothes. His face had the specific depletion of someone who had spent the night in a series of rooms making decisions with permanent consequences and was now standing in a doorway trying to locate the civilian register. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat on the couch with the careful movement of someone monitoring their structural integrity. Amara was asleep in the bedroom. The apartment, his apartment, a place she had been in for 36 hours and which felt simultaneously unfamiliar and more like safety than anywhere she'd been in months, was quiet with the morning quiet of a city resuming. She made coffee. She was not naturally a person who made coffee as a conflict avoidance mechanism, but her hands needed to do something and coffee was available. She brought 2 cups and sat in the chair across from the couch, and they sat in silence for a moment, which was a comfortable silence, which was a thing she had not expected to find with this man, but had found anyway. "Jun-seok," she said, "will face the council on his own terms. He was used. He knows it. They know it. He's finished as a leader, but he's not—" Min-jae paused. "He's not Lee Sung-han." She looked at her coffee. "And Lee Sung-han's daughter." will be provided for. He said it in the tone that meant it was already done. Anonymously. She won't know where it comes from. She doesn't need to. Naomi nodded. She held the cup with both hands and looked at the window where Sol's morning was coming in gray and thin and beginning to warm. What happens now? She said. He was quiet for a moment. To the organization, there are changes, restructuring. Some operations that needed to end have ended. Some things He stopped. He was choosing words with more care than usual, which meant he was trying to be honest rather than precise, and those were different efforts. There are things I built that I built because I could, because I had the capacity and the resources, and it never occurred to me to ask whether I should. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. 3 weeks in a dark room is a significant amount of time to ask that question. She looked at him. And what did you answer? Different answers for different things. He met her eyes. Some of it stays. Some of it goes. The hospital in Mapo that's been underfunded for 6 years gets funded. The childcare program in Dongdaemun that 3 council members have been blocking for reasons related entirely to their own real estate interests, that moves forward. He paused. Slowly, quietly, without announcements. Because announcements attract attention. Because it's not about the announcement. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the physician's folder, the adjusted pay rate, the car at 5 in the morning, the things he had done without telling her he was doing them in the weeks before she'd known enough to understand what they meant. You've been doing this for a while, she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. The cleaning salary wasn't the first time, she said. Was it? The Donghoro Clinic received new equipment in February, he said carefully. The children's ward specifically. She stared at him. The building manager on your street had he seemed to search for the right word. A change of perspective regarding the maintenance backlog. In January. January. Her voice was very quiet. I've been on this floor since October. Yes. You didn't know who I was in January. I was just a woman on a floor you assigned someone to clean. He held her gaze. You were a woman who talked to my unconscious patient every night and asked nothing back. He paused. I asked for a background report. Standard. And the report described a woman who was, the word my man used was overextended. Something moved across his face. He meant it as a neutral assessment. It wasn't neutral to me. Naomi sat with that. She sat with the entire architecture of it. The months of anonymous adjustments, the small structural changes to her life that she had attributed to luck, or timing, or the random minor mercy of a city that was mostly indifferent. She sat with the fact that she had been seen, carefully and without announcement, long before she knew there was anyone looking. She didn't know what to do with it. She turned it over and examined it from the angles available to her and found that none of them were simple. I don't know how to feel about that, she said finally. Honest. I know. He didn't dress it up. It's an overreach. I'm aware of that. He set the cup down. I can tell you the intention, but that doesn't determine what it is. No, she agreed. It doesn't. They were quiet. What I can tell you, he said slowly, is that it didn't start as strategy. It started as... He stopped. The searching for honest words effort again. I have spent a very long time in a world where everything is strategy, where attention is always transactional, where you notice someone because they're useful or dangerous, and those are the only 2 categories. He looked at his hands. You were neither of those things. You were someone being ground down by a weight that wasn't fair, and you were still, every night in that room, you were still just talking to someone because they deserved to hear a human voice. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't have a category for that. Naomi looked at him. She looked at the tattoos on his forearms, and the healing cut and the hospital pallor that hadn't fully left, and the face that was, in this moment, in this gray morning light, as unguarded as she had ever seen it. Amara likes you, she said. He looked up. She traced your tattoo for 20 minutes last night, Naomi said. She asked me what it was. I said a dragon. She said, like in my book? I said yes. She said, he's safe. She paused. 2.5-year-olds are very literal. If she says safe, she means safe. Something happened to his face, the small, controlled movement she had learned to read, the thing that came when something reached him that he wasn't defended against. He said, she's right that dragons are usually associated with Minjae. He stopped. She's right, Naomi said. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Seoul was accelerating into morning, the sounds of the city resuming its scale, the particular energy of a city that didn't pause for anyone and expected you to keep up. Inside, the apartment held its quiet. He said, I don't know how to do this. Do what? He gestured between them. Inexact. Unusual for a man who is precise about most things. This, whatever this is. He held her gaze. I know how to run organizations. I know how to read people's motives and plan for their failures. I know how to sit in a room with dangerous people and not blink. He paused. I don't know how to... He stopped again. I haven't had a person before. Not like... He moved his jaw. This is inadequate language. It is, she agreed. She let it sit for a moment. Then, you know how to show up. You've been doing it. She looked at him. That's most of it. He looked at her for a long time. I'm not a safe choice, he said. I want to be clear about that. The world I'm in, even with the changes, even with... He shook his head slightly. I'm not without complications. I'm a single black mother in Seoul who talks to unconscious patients and hides her kid in restricted hospital rooms, she said. I've never been a safe choice either. His mouth moved. It was not the tool smile, not the cold executive function, not any of the controlled registers she had cataloged over the past weeks. It was something much smaller and more genuine and considerably more difficult to look at directly. No, he said. I suppose you haven't. Amara appeared in his bedroom doorway. She was holding the substitute stuffed animal, and her hair was spectacular from sleep, and she looked at Min-jae on the couch, with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who had made a determination last night and saw no reason to revise it this morning. She walked across the apartment and climbed onto the couch beside him with the complete physical confidence of small children in spaces they've decided belong to them. She settled herself against his side and opened the stuffed animal's ear and appeared to whisper something into it. Min-jae sat very still. Not the tactical stillness, something more fundamental. The stillness of a man trying not to do anything that would disturb something fragile. Except it wasn't fragile, so she wasn't fragile. She was 2.5 and already certain. And the fragile one was him, sitting with his hands in his lap and a child pressed against his ribs. And the expression on his face was something that decades of power had never produced. Naomi watched them. She held her coffee cup and she watched her daughter lean against the most feared man in Seoul and point at one of his tattoos and say, very seriously, that one. And Min-jae looked down at his own arm and say, with the careful gravity of someone taking a question seriously, that's the tail. Does it hurt? Amara asked. Not anymore, he said. Amara considered this. Then she put her small finger on the beginning of the design, up near his elbow, and slowly traced it to the end, like she was following a path, like she was making sure she knew where it went. Okay, she said, satisfied. Min-jae looked up and found Naomi looking at him. He held her gaze across the quiet morning apartment, and she saw it in his face, the full weight of what had happened, the hospital room and the darkness and the voice in it, the 4 bullets and the 3 weeks and the counting of the cost. And on the other side of all of it this, a child tracing a map on his arm and a woman with her coffee, and morning coming through the window with the indifferent persistence of mornings everywhere. He had built an empire. He had built it from nothing, through methods that had required the systematic suppression of every instinct that was not strategic, and he had been very good at it, and it had protected him from the specific vulnerability of wanting things that could not be secured or acquired or managed into safety. He had wanted anyway. He had not chosen to. It had simply happened, in the dark, one voice at a time. The strongest man in the room, Naomi had once thought, was the one who controlled the room. She had grown up watching that equation operate, and she had organized her survival around the truth of it. She understood now, watching him sit carefully still so as not to disturb the child against his side, that the equation had a variable she hadn't accounted for, that there was a version of strength that looked nothing like control, that the man who had survived 4 bullets and 3 weeks of dark and the systematic dismantling of the thing he'd spent his life building was sitting on a couch at 7 in the morning, letting a toddler trace his tattoos, and his hands were completely still, and his face was completely open, and he was not managing any of it. He was just there. Amara finished tracing the dragon and looked up at him and said, Again? Min-jae looked at the small finger poised at his elbow. He looked at Naomi. She gave him nothing. No direction, no rescue, just watched him make the choice. He turned his arm over slightly so she had better access. Again, he said. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning the way Seoul always moved, enormous and indifferent and relentlessly forward. The Han River ran below the skyline, gray-blue in the early light, the bridges crossing it in their long arcs. Somewhere in the warehouse district, men were cleaning up a situation that was finished. Somewhere in a council chamber, decisions were being documented in the language of power. Somewhere in this city, Lee Sung-han's daughter was waking up without knowing why her life was going to be slightly more possible than it had been yesterday. None of that was in this room. In this room, there was coffee going cold and morning coming in, and a man who had learned, the hardest way available, that the thing you protect defines what you are. Not the empire, not the territory or the resources or the architecture of control. The thing you step out of a hospital bed for. The thing you move toward when the phone says they found it. The thing you sit still for, carefully, so it isn't disturbed. Naomi Carter set her cup down on the table. She looked at the two of them on the couch, the dragon and the child tracing it, and felt the particular quiet of a moment that didn't need anything added to it. Not commentary, not resolution, not the tying of loose ends into the neat bow that life almost never actually produced. Just this. Just the morning, and the room, and the three of them in it, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she did not do the math. She did not calculate the debt, or the risk, or the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She left the variables alone. She picked up her coffee. She sat back in the chair. She stayed.